Welcome to This Constitution. My name is Savannah Eccles Johnston, and we are joined by a very special guest today. We have Dr. Lucas Morel, who is a professor of ethics and politics at Washington and Lee University. He has written all the things about Lincoln and about Douglas and about Ralph Ellison, but today we're going to try and pull out all his expertise on Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. Because it's MLK Day. So, if it's okay with you, can I call you Lucas?
Please.
So if it's okay with you, I would like to compare Frederick Douglass and his view of the U.S. Constitution to MLK and his understanding of the U.S. Constitution and the American political order. I think everyone knows who MLK is. We don't need to introduce him. But many Americans are unfamiliar still with Frederick Douglass. So why should 21st Americans, first century Americans, know who this guy is?
Yeah, Frederick Douglass, there's actually a book published about 5 or 10 years ago that contained all the photographs of Frederick Douglass. He is most likely to have been the most photographed man in America in the 19th century. Why? Well, he was born into slavery in Maryland in what we think is February of 1818, no birth certificate, and lived until 1895. So almost every decade of the 19th century, a very tumultuous century. And in that time, he became famous for not just escaping enslavement, but by publishing not one, but 3 autobiographies and becoming one of the most famous abolitionists, orators, and writers in America. The most famous, I would think, is probably William Lloyd Garrison, famous for editing The Liberator. But Ralph Ellison basically spent his adult life speaking and writing on behalf of not just the abolition of slavery, but equality, equal citizenship, and especially the vote for Black Americans. And so he was the social, political activist of activists of the 19th century.
Right, so you mentioned equality and how hyper-focused Frederick Douglass is on this.
Sure.
Really, equality is understood in the Declaration of Independence. This man is a true believer. I mean, it wasn't just abolition for him. It was all the things. It was women's suffrage. He, for example, was at the Seneca Falls Convention.
Mm-hmm.
Frederick Douglass actually meant it. He actually believed it and acted on it.
Yeah, he would be what we call today an early adopter.
Yeah.
When he said or read all men are created equal, and of course the men means men and women, he thought it makes all the sense in the world that women who are human beings have the same rights that men do. And so, in fact, the very day he dies in February of 1895, what is he doing? He's at a women's meeting in Washington, D.C., comes home and falls over from more or less a heart attack. And so to the day he died, he is agitating for the rights of whoever isn't enjoying the full protection of their rights. And as I say, he was an early adopter on the question of the rights that women should not only possess, but they should be protected and exercised.
We'll talk about this later, Frederick Douglass as a founding father. But when it comes to founding fathers, Frederick Douglass makes a good one because there's not much about him that you can look back and say, well, tisk tisk on that view. He's really that true believer. So, but first, he undergoes this wonderful transformation in his life relative to the Declaration and the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
So early on, he adopts a Garrisonian view. You mentioned William Lloyd Garrison, who's this super famous abolitionist and who rejected the U.S. Constitution
Right.
as a pact with the devil, an agreement with hell for its slavery concessions, and as a result rejected the legitimacy of the U.S. government. He would not participate. He wouldn't vote.
He's a pacifist, yeah.
Yeah. This was Frederick Douglass's early view. Was he ever quite as extreme as Garrison?
I would say no. And what you've described well is what was known as the moral suasion school or camp of abolitionism. And as those words would suggest, moral suasion or persuasion, according to this school, all that you could do to produce moral reformation, because it happens in the heart, in someone's character or soul, if you will, these are things that cannot be coerced or compelled. Interestingly enough, as you point out, his pacifism, Garrison's, you cannot coerce it either through lawless violence or lawful violence. In other words, by the force of law. You remember scolding a little kid and he could be, I'm sitting on the outside, but I'm standing on the inside. True moral reform had to come as a conviction from within, and that conviction is produced by God's grace, Garrison had shall we say, an idiosyncratic understanding of the Bible. But basically, he thought God and I are a majority, and he thought all we are responsible to do is to convince slaveholders that what they're doing is a sin in the eyes of God and that they should repent of their ways. We're doing them a favor by pointing out what they're doing wrong, right? Friends like these, who needs enemies? And so all you could do is moral suasion. You couldn't force someone or compel them, whether through violence or through the law. Frederick Douglass held that view for the most part. But remember, how does he get to know William Lloyd Garrison? It's because he wasn't a pacifist when it came to his own freedom. He fled at great risk to life and limb and would have used force to defend himself if necessary, and famously uses force to prevent a flogging by this slave breaker named Edward Covey, which he recounts in his autobiographies. So Garrison, oh my goodness, he actually writes an editorial that's essentially an address to slaves where he tells them, I mean, this guy's at least consistent. Garrison says you should use every means to escape, but you cannot use force if that's what's necessary for you to liberate yourself. But do know that abolitionists in the North are your greatest friends. Clearly, Douglass didn't buy that. But he eventually shifts his opinion with regards to the Constitution later when he decides to edit his own newspaper.
Right. So the Garrisonian view is a tough pill to swallow if you're Frederick Douglass.
Or any enslaved person,
Or any
yes.
enslaved person. And so in some ways, Frederick Douglass, although, he becomes close friends with Garrison.
Yes.
Frederick Douglass is much more in the American tradition, the Declaration tradition of the right to revolution, including violent revolution if rights are being violated. So
yes.
He's much more American in that sense than William Lloyd Garrison was.
Yes, Garrison was of two minds on the Declaration. He never, that I know of, said a bad thing about the Declaration, but he definitely shied away from the revolution, alter or abolish part of the Declaration. For him, the Declaration was gospel because it talked about equality, it talked about rights. He didn't say or draw our attention to the revolution part. So in that sense, Douglass believed in the Declaration more than Garrison did.
Right. And he's just a little bit more founded in reality, right? That's nice. You say, I need to escape with any way, not violence.
Right.
That's not going to work. So you speak about this evolution in Frederick Douglass, that by the time you get to 1850, 1851,
right.
He's broken with Garrison and started his own newspaper.
Yes.
He's writing his own stuff here.
Right.
And his views begin to change. So what changes? How does he go from Constitution bad to Constitution is a pro-freedom document? Yeah,
he certainly, and that's an understatement, Constitution bad. He was of the Garrisonian view that the Constitution was pro-slavery, and in that sense didn't differ from John C. Calhoun and apologists, defenders of slavery. And in fact, slavery was good for the slave as well as the enslaver, bizarro land. But we could, that's another conversation. Up until about 1850, Frederick Douglass believes that the Constitution is pro-slavery because of the compromises with slavery, the 3/5 Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and the Non-Importation Clause of the Constitution. And there are others, but those are the three big ones. He comes back from self-exile in the United Kingdom in 1847 when he's finally legally manumitted and can actually walk the streets without fear of apprehension under the Fugitive Slave Act. In 1847, he gives a speech that some people title The Right to Criticize American Institutions, and he has to defend how he's been criticizing America abroad, its constitution, its government, and its church. Those were consistent ones for him. And it can be boiled down to saying, look, how can I love a country that doesn't love me? It tells me in so many ways that I'm not a part of this country. I have no patriotism. The Constitution should be shivered into 1,000 fragments, and we should, the government should be overthrown. I'm not sure who would be doing it if you're a pacifist, but at any rate, he does not mind if America went down the toilet. In late 47, with major support from British friends, fellow abolitionists, he edits the North Star. He begins with another political activist named Martin Delany. But it's through editing his own newspaper, an abolitionist newspaper, that Douglas starts doing more reading on the subject. And he says explicitly, three guys in particular shaped his thinking and changed his mind: William Goodell, Lysander Spooner, and a guy who became a very good friend and major benefactor, or one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest man in New York, a guy named Garrett Smith. And he learns that, hey, wait a second. I didn't really notice that the word slave and slavery, they aren't in the Constitution. Why are we defending something that's not even said out loud? And in fact, the mission statement of the Constitution, the preamble, it talks about justice. It talks about the blessings of liberty. Where is slavery in any of this? You guys of the pro-slavery camp have to persuade me. The burden is on you to show me that this is a Constitution that defends this contradiction to the American principles as we find them in the Declaration. And so he announces this publicly. Garrison's furious in 1850 and 1851. And then his big coming out speech is the most famous Frederick Douglass speech. It actually doesn't have a title, but we have titled it, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." That's not his title, but that's the title we give it. It's a line from the speech. And in that speech, Frederick Douglass says it is interpreted in a particular way. The Constitution is a glorious liberty document. And it is a glorious liberty document for the reasons I mentioned, and because he says we get into trouble when we start trying to guess at what the intentions of the framers were. They met in secret. And so all the American people had was, they didn't have Madison's notes. Madison kept those secret for a reason, for his reasons that we find out later. But if we don't really know what their intentions were, the only thing we have is the document. So he says, stay within the four corners of the document, give it its plain reason, its plain reading. It's a document that doesn't belong to lawyers. It belongs to the American people. And so they should interpret it as they understand it in terms of its mission statement and operate accordingly.
Right. Well, and this idea of the mission statement, this is useful. Frederick Douglass is always wedded to the Declaration and its ideas of natural rights and equality.
Yes, he was a Lockean through and through.
Right. But his view on the Constitution changes as an adequate vehicle for the Declaration, as getting us, delivering us to the destination that it sets out for us.
Right.
So he comes around and says, actually, this is pretty good. This is a pretty good vehicle. It fits the character of the American people, and they can interpret it. So here's a question for you. When he is reading the Constitution, would Frederick Douglass have said that the 13th Amendment was necessary to abolish slavery? Could you have just done it with a law?
Yes. He's categorical about that. He doesn't mind an amendment because that makes it explicit.
Right.
But even before the 13th Amendment was passed in early 1865 and then ratified in December of 65, Ellison, before this, I keep saying Ellison, sorry, Ralph Ellison is a huge hero of mine and interest of mine. But Frederick Douglass, even before the Civil War, is saying, and under the influence of guys like Lysander Spooner and Garrett Smith, he says Congress has authority under the Constitution to treat slavery more or less, the phrase we would use today is more or less as an existential threat to the Republic. And if you have this thing that could cause tumult and disruption in civil society, Congress has every authority and duty to address it. And so before the Civil War commences, Douglass is arguing for the immediate abolition, not just of slavery, make sure it doesn't expand out into the Western territories, federal territories. That's what the Republicans were saying. He's like, no, that's not going far enough. Any inch of American soil, the federal government has authority to abolish it, and that includes the states where it's legal, the slave states.
Right. So he's a different view than Lincoln here.
Oh my goodness. This is the biggest difference between Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, is that Lincoln does not believe that the Constitution equips the federal government to address slavery as an intra-state, that is to say, a domestic institution, something that is occurring within the confines of the borders of a particular state. Lincoln is a fierce defender of federalism in this sense, whereas Douglass thinks the federal government has a lot more power under the Constitution than Lincoln does. Lincoln's decision is, or thinking is, we can get rid of slavery ultimately, as he says, we should put it on the course of ultimate extinction by first banning the importation of slaves, so it's reduced the supply, in which they did in 1808, as soon as they could under the Constitution, and then they equated it with piracy in 1820. Hanging by the neck until dead is the punishment. So reduce the supply that way, cut it off, and prevent it from expanding. That's what we saw in the Northwest Ordinance. That's what we saw in the Compromise of 1820 with Missouri. This is the way that slavery will essentially die on the vine. And Douglas says that does not go far enough. Slavery exists as this abiding daily threat to the Republic, and the federal government has every authority under the Constitution to abolish it if you get a majority of the American people that say so.
Right, so this is a key distinction. Both believe that the Constitution is a fundamentally anti-slavery document.
Yes.
But they simply disagree on what the federal government has power to do.
What powers they have, correct.
Immediately relative to slavery.
Yes.
If, and again, I want to emphasize this, if you need an amendment to abolish slavery, then there is an argument that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. But if you don't need that amendment, if it's good to have the amendment, then it can be a fundamentally anti-slavery document because just a law could have changed it, and all the powers are given to Congress to do so, in Frederick Douglass's view.
In Frederick Douglass's view, Lincoln would have still said that the Constitution is anti-slavery,
right,
while conceding that in order to get the Constitution, that is to say, in order to establish this structure that would maintain and fortify to form a more perfect union of American states, we had to make some concessions to a numerical minority of the states, especially South Carolina and Georgia. That's an obligation that we have to uphold. We would not have gotten the Constitution but for those concessions, and therefore we have to abide. It is so nominated in the bond, as they say. And so Lincoln still says, no, it's emphatically anti-slavery, but not categorically so, because there are these compromises. Right. And the peculiar thing in terms of Douglas's interpretation of the Constitution, again, following Goodell and Spooner and Smith, their peculiar interpretation of the Constitution is they came up with different categories or classes of individuals in those compromises with regards to slavery that don't apply to slaves. So, for example, owing service or labor to another, Douglas did not interpret that as applying to the enslaved person. He said, well, slaves can't owe service to anyone. They don't have moral agency according to the law, so it can't apply to slaves. So they found clever ways to get around what the conventional wisdom was clearly that these were compromises with slavery.
Right.
But they're like, no, they didn't use the word slave. There are classes of citizens who were imported, classes of people who were imported in the United States that weren't slaves, indentured servants and others. And so they found, as I say, unique, idiosyncratic ways of interpreting the slavery compromises of the Constitution so that it would be consistent with it being uniformly anti-slavery. I will say this, that there were times when Douglas said, for the sake of argument, arguendo, let's concede that the Fugitive Slave Act really did apply to escaped slaves, or let's concede that the compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise, was counting slaves in the aggregate for purposes of representation numbers. He said that clearly, by the writings of the founders, was scaffolding for a building that once the building has been erected and established and kind of fully functioning, operating, you don't leave the scaffolding there. So you take the scaffolding away. And so there were times when Douglas made the argument that, okay, let me just be with you for a second and concede that maybe these were compromises with slaveholding states. It was understood that slavery was supposed to go away and we were supposed to wean ourselves off of it. We can't use those things as integral parts of the building that, if we don't have this, the building falls apart. He's like, no, scaffolding at best. That's his view.
Right. And this is key. Frederick Douglass this is not just a rhetorical shift for him. This isn't just we have to start saying this or its abolition is dead in the grave. No,
for him, he would say that the arguments he's making, these are principled arguments. It's not just a rhetorical shift. Those who there are those today, scholars who contest this and say, no, Douglas just realized rhetorically he'll be more effective if he stops saying that it's a pro-slavery constitution. Most people think it's an anti-slavery one. Let's go with that. I'll admit that there is at least a healthy debate among scholars about this, but I think there is enough in Douglas's writings to make that he would argue that this isn't simply a rhetorical. These are principled arguments made with a coherent interpretation of constitutional construction, and he's willing to live with that.
And it seems evidence for that is how much further he goes than Lincoln is willing to go. And
Oh yeah,
that seems to be at least evidence. I mean, if you're just doing it for rhetorical purposes, don't go any further than Lincoln does, but he goes way beyond Lincoln.
oh for sure.
So this brings us to this next question I'm interested to hear your thoughts on. So we do happily get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It's this new birth of freedom. Some people have called it a refounding of America. In this new refounding, this new birth of freedom, there have to be new founding fathers, or at least another generation of them.
Hmm.
Is Frederick Douglass right next to Lincoln at the very top of that group?
I'll begin with this caveat. I don't like the thought of those, even as monumental as those amendments were. I don't like the thought of that era as being a time of refounding.
Mm.
For me, a refounding requires a change in regime principles, and maybe this is idiosyncratic to me, but my definition of founding is when something truly new has come into being. Whereas the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, if you look at the arguments, guess what they're quoting? The Declaration of Independence. So
Right.
the regime has not changed. Does the regime have the wherewithal and structural openings by which it can improve delivering on the goods that it promises? Yes, those are known as amendments. And so for me, that isn't a refounding. We're not starting over. Even when Richard Brookhiser does a great job of this in Founder's Son, his biography of Lincoln, when he says in the Gettysburg Address, when Lincoln says a new birth of freedom, he doesn't say a birth of new freedoms.
Right.
The freedoms are the same. The freedoms have always been there. The rights that people are born with are rights that they were given by their creator, not by government. What government provides is the enforcement of the things that you already own or possess. So I guess that's a huge disclaimer or caveat for me, Fred. So
Well,
I don't
let's
see
stop
those as a
there.
refounding. I see those as forming a more perfect union and doing a better job of making explicit the purposes for which the document exists.
Well, this is actually really useful. The Declaration is always the destination. It is in 1787 and it is in 1865.
Yeah.
It was always the destination. If anything, it's just the vehicle got souped up a little bit better or was brought closer to the Declaration's original intention,
Sure.
et cetera, et cetera. So maybe that's a better way of saying it than a refounding.
Yeah.
Is destination's the same, we souped up the vehicle. Right, with these amendments.
It was
Okay,
a
good.
political
So,
sciencey term, souped up the vehicle. So go ahead.
yeah, I read that in my Intro to American Politics
There
course.
you go.
So we get Frederick Douglass and we get Lincoln in this new birth of freedom. Do they count though? Are they founding fathers of the nation?
I would not use the word founding for the very reason that Lincoln did not see himself as a founder. Or there are people who treat and interpret Lincoln as a refounder. Lincoln is entirely dependent on the Declaration of Independence when he's arguing for the prevention of the expansion of slavery, and when he argues near the end of his political life for the vote to be given to at least black men in 1865. Lincoln sees all of those things as a coming to fruition of the principles and promises that are laid out in the Declaration. And so the word I prefer to use, which is not a word we use very often today, I wonder why, is the word statesman. We usually use the word statesman for politicians. So Lincoln's clearly one. He's not just a good president. I think he's the best one we've ever had. And he rises to the level of statesmanship. We only cite a few people as statesmen because of the way he went about helping a country do the right thing by its population. It wasn't something Lincoln could do by himself. Even emancipation was highly controversial in the North. The Republicans lost seats that fall as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. What we see as a slam dunk, a no-brainer, was incredibly contested at that time. Again, north of the Mason-Dixon line. And so statesmanship in a republic requires politicians who can bring the people along to a better version of themselves and to remind them that that version isn't something that they came up with, at least the politician. That version was laid out for them by their forefathers in the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln did that masterfully, better than anybody in our history. Now, what about Douglas? Is Douglas a part of that? Absolutely, precisely because he, like Lincoln, saw the principles of the Declaration as what he calls saving principles. He called them the sheet anchor, the lodestar of the American Republic. And so Douglas, insofar as his editorials, speeches, autobiography, point people back as a way to go forward, as a way for them to be persuaded. In this country, you have to persuade people to do things politically by consent, right? That's justice requires that you get their consent before you do something. To the extent that Douglas was able to move the needle on freedom and equality and rights, to that extent, I think, even though he never held elected office, he was appointed a federal marshal and also a liaison or an envoy to Haiti. Frederick Douglass can be considered a statesman because of the way he used the English language, the King's English, as it were, on behalf of the principles of the regime.
Okay, so Douglas is one of our great statesmen.
Absolutely.
That's how you'd rank him. Now I want to turn to MLK.
Sure.
Because it's this wonderful comparison. We've spoken about how Frederick Douglass is so wedded to the Declaration and as a result to the Constitution as the best method to bring us to that destination. MLK goes the opposite direction. He seems to become increasingly critical of the American constitutional order, potentially also because of the Declaration. So MLK throughout his career frequently refers back to the Declaration.
Yes.
Right? It's the basics. Again, that's natural rights. It's the equality, the I Have a Dream speech.
Yeah.
So what is his problem with the American constitutional order? What is it about it that is deficient in terms of the Declaration?
Yeah. He's pretty steadfast about the Declaration of Independence. Right? He's the one who calls it an American creed in the I Have a Dream speech. So when something is a creed, you ain't going to amend that. That thing's pretty set in cement, okay? So it is well-nigh sacred, okay? So he never disagreed about all men are created equal. He never disagreed about government by consent of the governed, rights as the equal possession of every human being. What he disagreed with was the capacity of the United States Constitution and ultimately the American people to make good on what he understood to be the promises of the Declaration. So his understanding of equality needed to be something more along the lines of equality of results rather than just equality of opportunity. This happens markedly after the I Have a Dream speech. As early as 1964, he writes a book where, you know, the famous line from the I Have a Dream speech, well, there's a lot of famous lines from that speech, but one of them is, I have a dream that one day my 4 little children will grow up in a country or live in a country where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. So that's his dream. That sounds like a colorblind constitution, right? Now, what happens, that line he uses as an epigraph to Why We Can't Wait, which is the title of a short book that he writes in 1964. And in that book, he talks about what the word we use today is reparations, but he talks about the need to come up with something like a GI Bill of Rights for what he calls the disadvantaged, a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged, in the same way that not just Black people in general, but poor people in this country have been harmed by the legacy of racial enslavement and segregation. Even whites were, especially poor whites, were impacted by that they had to compete against slave labor. In the same way that Blacks have been harmed, not just financially, but psychically, in other words, in terms of their souls, their psyche. He believes that there should be massive federal payments for those who were injured by centuries of racial oppression. And so this Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged, as well as what we call today universal basic income, he was arguing for that in the 1960s. He thought the only way to kind of speed up freedom, right? Remember what else was happening in 1964? The Civil Rights Act is being passed, the Voting Rights Act of 65, but the results aren't coming quick enough for King. And he really starts getting it into his head that what happened to black people, his black ancestors, centuries before, has had an impact on his soul well into the 20th century. And so eventually in 1967, he goes up to a pretty tough part of Chicago to write a book that becomes Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And in that book, in a sense, he rejects the idea of a colorblind legal system for this country as being insufficient to create a truly equal society. And he begins to think and argue that color really does matter in a way more profoundly than simply leveling the playing field and let's see how things go from here. Frederick Douglass always was willing to promote a society where it's just fair play, justice for all. Don't treat anybody as an exception in the law, whether favoritism or burdens on them. King comes to the point of making an argument for reparations. And interestingly enough, he says the reparations aren't just good financially. The best things, he says, are going to happen within the souls, if you will, of black folk. He says, you would be amazed if we were to ever do this, how quickly the psyches, especially of black males, black men, that the repair that will happen to their souls in motivation and attitude and striving, their sense of, as he called it, somebodiness. He said he has to admit that a lot of this cannot happen simply, he was explicit. A lot of this cannot happen simply by leveling the playing field. Massive federal interventions are going to have to occur. And to that extent, I think it reinforces a notion of black inferiority and white supremacy that Frederick Douglass categorically disagreed with.
So, but in many ways, MLK kind of wins this argument. You see it with affirmative action
Yes.
regimes,
Yes.
with differences or changes in how we view equality, right?
Yeah, equity, not
equity,
equality. Yeah,
right.
notice how almost nobody speaks of equality anymore.
Right. So, kind of, MLK won.
Yes.
But
hard to disagree with that.
Right. But in so doing, you think he rejected the American constitutional order and kind of left it behind. So where does that leave us? We seem to just reinterpret the Constitution to include his understandings, right?
Well, again, because what's his most famous writing? He has two famous writings. One's a speech, one's an essay. The essay is Letter from a Birmingham Jail, made most famous because of a PR campaign in 1963 in April when he's in solitary confinement from his protests against a federal court order not to march on Easter weekend in Birmingham, Alabama. So he writes this 7,000-word essay that becomes famous because he defends in a very articulate way the strategy of civil disobedience. Okay, it's not just a strategy of nonviolence, it's civil disobedience, that you can break a law or defy a court order to call attention to the evil, suffer the punishment for it as a way of showing support for the regime in general. That's his most famous essay. The most famous speech is the I Have a Dream speech, August 28th, 1963. Well, what does he say? In that speech, he calls essentially a combination of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution what? A promissory note. And he's clever, right? Promissory note, not only in a kind of fiendish way.
Right.
He's clever in realizing that, oh, money is a promissory note, payable upon demand, right? The money is actually just a piece of paper. It doesn't have any value. It has value because the government's behind it and says if you're selling something, you have to take it in payment. You can't insist, where's that silver? Where's that gold?
Right.
So for King to refer to those organic formative documents of our nation's history, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, to refer to those as promissory notes, in that way, he most emphatically said, I'm on the side of the angels, at least in terms of America. I'm on the side of the regime, not just its principles, but its structures. That's 63. But already brewing, as I said, as early as 64, and then certainly the culmination is 67, a year before he tragically dies, is assassinated. By 67, and where do we go from here? He is making explicit the argument that black people in 1967 are incapable of being the full beneficiaries of the American dream and living life under the laws and constitutions of this constitution of this country without massive federal funds.
And that to do so, you have to radically change how you view the U.S. Constitution.
Well, what has to change is you have to say that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution does empower Congress to spend money in support of a particular cohort or section of the American population, that you should be able to tax everybody for the sake of repairing the damage done to the souls of a numerical minority of this country as a result of centuries of racial oppression.
Right. So we spoke about the refounding, this idea of a refounding just a little bit ago. This would be part of it. If you refounded the United States, according to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, if it refounded, redid the document in some significant way, then through those three, you can make these changes or reinterpret Article 1, Section 8, for example.
Very good. So I think that's good that you brought up, especially the fact that in those amendments they all contain a clause that says, oh, and by the way, Congress has the power to enforce this. And so you take Article 1, Section 8, which is the broad delegation of authority to Congress. Congress doesn't get, despite what it looks like these days, Congress doesn't get to legislate on whatever they want, right? We still have states, we still have state governments, we still have state legislatures. These are known as exercising the police powers, the power to promote the safety, health, welfare, and morals of the community. The one thing I remembered from state and local government. Congress doesn't have that plenary authority to just do good as long as you have the majority behind you. But with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, right, what does equal protection mean? What does due process mean? What are the privileges or immunities? That's up to Congress to define. How do you define slavery, right? The 13th Amendment got rid of it, but Congress gets to enforce it. Same for the 15th Amendment with regards to the vote, but especially the 14th Amendment. You're right. It would constitute a refounding if you have a very different notion of limited government, a very different notion of what the powers of that Congress are in light of the objectives of that amendment. And so in that sense, yes, you could understand them interpreted a certain way to be a kind of refounding that King would have been entirely on board with.
Right. This also goes back to competing notions of the Declaration and what it means by life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, right? Is it a very negative liberty or is it an overwhelmingly positive liberty?
Sure.
So we have two very different understandings of the U.S. Constitution, of the Declaration and what it means, and how to view the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, one from Frederick Douglass and one from MLK. In your opinion, because you know more than anyone else in this room about this, who got it right?
Well, I'll begin by saying, returning us to the beginning where we talked about the differences between Frederick Douglass and Lincoln. I don't have any tattoos, but if I were to get a tattoo of heroes, it would be a tattoo of Lincoln, not of Douglass, and certainly not of Martin Luther King Jr. So because I have a Lincolnian understanding of the Constitution, that leads me to think, well, who's closer to Lincoln? Is it King or is it Douglass? And I'm going to go with Douglass on that. And so I would put all my eggs in the Douglass basket. But I will hasten to add that King and the civil rights, what I call the modern civil rights movement, you could kind of look at all of American history as one long civil rights movement with a few major hiccups along the way. But with Martin Luther King Jr., I think we see a reinterpretation of the founding that was not quite as beholden to the founding principles as Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, as you said earlier, was a true believer in these principles. He believed in them at a time when he believed in them more than most white Americans believed in their principles. And so I would say that I think Douglass understood at least what the founders were doing better than King. I don't know that King ever said that any of the founding principles were wrong or any of the founders were wrong. I think rhetorically he was smarter than that. But in principle, King came to believe what he called this thing called color shock, that there was a way in which color still has this power over people in the United States if you will. I mean, put it starkly, that white supremacy still is a palpable reality, if not explicitly in law. It's in the mores of the people. And that King recognized this is something that even though he was calling for federal intervention and federal funding, he says some of these things that have to happen in the souls of white people, he said, can't happen as a result of law. And that was troubling for King. And so that's why he had to write for two audiences. He had to write in a way that would inspire blacks to still strive and be motivated, and that sense of somebodyness. He had to speak to that even before the obstacles were removed. So in that sense, he was like Douglass. But he also had to speak, and did, to a white audience and saying, these are the ways you got to change in your mindset. And this is what you got to be willing to literally pay for in order for this country to truly be all that America ought to be. And I think at the end of the day, that vision for America was different than the vision that Frederick Douglass had. For me, at the end of the day, Frederick Douglass's vision overlapped much more closely to Lincoln than Martin Luther King's did.
Mm. In a future podcast episode, I'd love to hear why you would rather have a tattoo of Lincoln than Douglass, but we don't have time.
Remember,
now.
I said, if I have to have a tattoo, I'm not intending to, and will never have a tattoo, Lord willing.
Well, this was fabulous. Thank you for your time. We so appreciate it.
Sure. Love being on here.